The morning mist hung low over the fields of Waterland, a serene patchwork of green just outside the bustle of Amsterdam. The dew clung to the tall grass, shimmering in the pale light as Jan van der Bos made his way through the narrow path between his tulip beds and vegetable rows. For Jan, this farm was not simply land. It was his bloodline, his history, and his promise to the generations before him. Birdsong floated through the cool air, accompanied by the gentle creak of the old windmill that stood at the far end of his property. This windmill had turned for more than a century, guarding the land from the encroaching waters. Jan paused to touch its weathered wood, a ritual he had followed every morning for years. Inside the farmhouse, the smell of fresh bread drifted from the oven. Jan's sister, Anna, was at the kitchen table, sipping her coffee. Her eyes followed Jan as he took off his coat and sat opposite her. She sensed the heaviness in his posture. He had been thinking of Lars, his only son. Lars had always been a bright boy, with a mind that wandered far beyond the village. At university in the city, he had taken to the world of innovation and technology, speaking of apps, investments, and the future. But with each visit home, Jan had noticed the distance between them growing, like a hairline crack in ice. 2 nights ago, Lars had returned from Amsterdam. Not for the warmth of home, but with a proposition. Over dinner, in a voice that carried both urgency and ambition, he had asked Jan to sell the farm. He spoke of an opportunity to fund a revolutionary urban technology business, promising that it would change their lives forever. Jan had listened, letting his son finish, before quietly shaking his head. His answer was simple. This farm would not be sold. It had weathered storms, wars, and floods. It would not be lost to a gamble. Lars's eyes had gone cold then, his smile thin as paper. He had left the table without a word, his footsteps echoing up the stairs. That night, Jan had lain awake, the sound of the windmill outside masking his unease. Now, as Jan broke his bread, Anna spoke softly. She had overheard voices in the barn last night. Lars was there, speaking to someone on the phone. His tone had been sharp, almost urgent. Anna had caught only fragments of his words, but they had unsettled her. Jan brushed it aside, telling himself it was nothing more than business talk. But when he stepped outside to tend to the greenhouse, he noticed fresh tire tracks in the damp soil near the gate. Lars did not own a car. The wind shifted, bringing with it the faint sound of the city from the west. Somewhere beyond those fields, a plan was already in motion. And Jan, though he did not yet know it, was at the center of it. The rain had just begun to fall when Jan walked into Amsterdam that afternoon. He had business in the city, a delivery of tulips to an old friend's shop in the Jordan district. The streets glistened under the dim light, bicycles swishing past with the ease of locals accustomed to the weather. After leaving the flowers, Jan decided to stop at De Haven, a small cafe tucked between a bookshop and a cheese store. It was the sort of place where conversations were spoken in low tones, and the air always smelled faintly of cinnamon. He had barely sat down when a voice from a nearby table caught his ear. Lars was there. His back was to Jan, but the voice was unmistakable. Across from him sat a tall man in a dark coat, his face partly hidden by the brim of a hat. The two spoke in Dutch, but the words carried a weight that transcended language. Jan heard talk of investors, of deadlines, of a critical sum of money that needed to be secured. Then came the words that made Jan's blood run cold. Once the land is signed over, everything else will fall into place. Lars lowered his voice, leaning closer to the man. Jan strained to listen, but the hum of the cafe swallowed the rest. His coffee sat untouched as he tried to make sense of what he had heard. Was his son planning to go behind his back? And who was this stranger? The tall man rose first, slipping a card across the table before walking out into the rain. Lars remained seated, staring at the card as if it held the key to his future. Then, without warning, he pulled out his phone and began recording a voice message. Jan could hear his tone, sharp and deliberate, though the words were lost under the clinking of cups. Before Jan could decide whether to approach, Lars stood and left, the door chime ringing faintly behind him. Jan sat frozen, his heart heavy with a mixture of anger and worry. Whatever Lars was planning, it was moving forward quickly. Outside, the rain had grown heavier. Jan pulled his coat tighter and stepped into the street, but Lars was already gone, swallowed by the city's winding canals and alleyways. All that remained was the echo of his words and the uneasy certainty that something dangerous was unfolding just beyond Jan's reach. The wind rattled the shutters as Jan returned to the farmhouse that night. Anna was already in bed, but the old radio on the kitchen counter hummed quietly, casting a soft glow in the dark. Jan poured himself a glass of water, his mind still replaying the scene in the cafe. The voice, the stranger, the words about the land. He walked into the study, a small room lined with books, maps of the farm, and yellowing photographs of his father. He switched on the desk lamp and sat down, pulling out an old ledger. He had to be certain every boundary, every deed was still in his name. His finger traced the neat handwriting on the faded paper, a record of decades of careful stewardship. The silence was broken by a faint buzz. It was coming from under the desk. Jan crouched down and found a small black device taped beneath the drawer. His breath caught. It was a recorder, no bigger than a matchbox, with a blinking red light. Hands steady but cold, Jan clicked it off. He hesitated, then pressed play. The device crackled to life, and his own voice filled the room. His conversations with Anna over the past week, every word captured. And then, disturbingly, parts of the recordings sounded altered. His tone was twisted, his words rearranged to suggest arguments that had never happened. Jan set the recorder down, his mind racing. Lars had been here. He had planted this. But why? Was he trying to create the image of a man unfit to handle his own affairs? The thought turned Jan's stomach. From upstairs came the faint creak of a floorboard. Jan froze, his ears straining in the darkness. He was certain Anna was asleep. Slowly, he reached for the heavy torch that hung on the wall and stepped into the hall. The next sound was not a creak, but the unmistakable click of the back door shutting. Whoever had been inside was now gone, swallowed by the night and the rain. Jan's hand tightened around the torch. Someone was watching him, closer than he had imagined. The following morning, the air above the canal shimmered with a pale mist. Jan had barely slept. The image of the recorder still burned into his mind. He left the farmhouse early, cycling into Amsterdam under a sky that threatened rain again. His destination was clear. He needed answers, and he suspected the man from the cafe held them. The Jordan district was already stirring, shop shutters clattering open, the scent of baking bread drifting along the narrow streets. Jan stopped near the cafe, but did not go inside. Instead, he kept his eyes on the bridge where he had last seen Lars disappear. It was there that Jan spotted him, the tall man in the dark coat, standing by the water, speaking into his phone. Jan stayed at a distance, his bicycle propped against the rail. The man's voice was low but urgent. Then Jan heard a phrase that made him lean closer. Once the papers are signed, the footage goes public. Jan's pulse quickened. Footage. Could it be linked to the manipulated recordings he had found? Before he could move, the man glanced around, his gaze briefly sweeping over January. Without hesitation, he turned and walked briskly towards a side street. Jan followed. The chase wound through a labyrinth of alleys, past quiet courtyards and closed shop fronts. At a bend in the street, Jan lost sight of him. He stood still, catching his breath, listening for footsteps. That was when he noticed the faint glow of light from a warehouse door slightly ajar. He approached, peered inside, and saw a laptop open on a table. A video played on the screen, his own voice, angry and accusing, spliced into a conversation that had never taken place. In the background, Lars's voice added context that made Jan appear dangerous, unstable. Jan's breath caught. It was evidence, but also a weapon, one that could destroy him if it reached the wrong hands. He stepped forward, ready to take the laptop, when the door behind him slammed shut. The sound of the door reverberated through the dimly lit warehouse. Jan spun around, his eyes adjusting to the gloom. Shadows stretched across the floor, and the faint scent of damp wood filled the air. Somewhere above, a pigeon flapped its wings in the rafters. He crossed to the door and tugged the handle. It was locked. He tried again, harder this time, but it held fast. The only light came from the laptop screen, still playing the doctored footage in a loop. He began searching for another way out. The windows were high and barred. At the back of the room, he found a stairway leading to a mezzanine, but it only led to a locked office. His frustration grew. He could not stay here. Lars was clearly moving faster than he had imagined. Then, faintly, he heard footsteps outside.
Someone was speaking.
The words were muffled, but the tone was unmistakable. Lars. Jan's throat tightened. He crept towards the door, pressing his ear to the wood. Keep him there until I call. Do not let him out. Jan stepped back, his mind racing. If Lars was working with the man in the coat, then his son was orchestrating more than just a business scheme. He was building a trap, one that required Jan to be discredited, perhaps even removed entirely. The footsteps faded. Jan looked back at the laptop. It might hold the key to proving his innocence, but there was no time. He picked it up and searched for something, anything, to force the door. His eyes fell on an old metal pole leaning in the corner. As he jammed it into the lock, a shadow moved across the window, followed by the sharp scrape of metal. Someone was unlocking the door from the outside. The door swung open, and Jan tensed, ready to confront whoever stood there. To his surprise, it was not the tall man nor Lars, but a woman he recognized from the flower market in Nordermarkt. Her name was Eva, a vendor who sold rare blooms. Quick, she whispered, glancing over her shoulder. They will be back. Jan hesitated. Why are you helping me? No time, she replied, stepping inside and pulling him towards the side door. I know what they are planning. Lars is in deeper than you think. They slipped out into a narrow lane that wound behind the warehouse. The rain had begun again, light but steady, dampening the cobblestones. Eva moved quickly, her eyes scanning for anyone following. Jan kept pace, clutching the laptop under his coat. Once they reached the safety of a canal bridge, Eva spoke. Lars has been offered a deal by people who want your land for development. They promised him the funds for his business if he can take control of the farm. The videos, they're meant to make you seem unfit, so the court will hand him power. Jan's stomach churned. Why tell me this? Because my brother once worked for them. He tried to back out, and they ruined him. I will not let them do it to you. A sudden noise made them both turn. Across the canal, a figure stood in the shadows, watching. The brim of the hat gave him away. The man in the coat. The man did not move, but Jan could feel his gaze fixed on them. The street was otherwise empty, the lamps casting long beams over the still water. Eva's voice was low. We need to move.
Now.
They crossed the bridge quickly, turning into a street lined with tall, narrow houses. The canals glistened beside them, the rain forming ripples across the surface. Behind them, footsteps began to echo, steady and deliberate. Jan and Eva ducked into a small courtyard, the scent of wet brick and moss filling the air. They waited, breathless. The footsteps grew louder, then stopped. Silence. Jan strained to listen, but the only sound was the gentle splash of water against the quay. When they stepped back onto the street, the man was gone. But Eva did not look relieved. He will not stop, she said. Once they know you have the laptop, they will do anything to get it back. They made their way to Eva's flat in the Pitch district, a small place above a bakery. Inside, Jan placed the laptop on the table. Eva opened it and began to copy the files. The screen flickered, showing folder after folder of audio and video clips, each one edited to make Jan look volatile, dishonest, even violent. Jan felt the weight of it all pressing down. This was no longer about land or money. This was about erasing him completely. Eva's hands paused on the keyboard. They are tracking the device, she whispered. They know exactly where we are. The words had barely left her mouth when the lights in the flat went out. The hum of the fridge stopped, leaving only the sound of rain on the window. From the street below came the screech of tires. Eva moved to the window, lifting the curtain just enough to peek outside. A black van had stopped in the middle of the street. Two figures stepped out, one of them the man in the coat. They disappeared into the bakery entrance below. They're coming up, Eva said. She unplugged the laptop and shoved it into a canvas bag. Jan followed her to the back room, where a narrow fire escape led down into an alley. They descended quickly, the metal steps slick with rain. As they reached the bottom, the sound of boots echoed above. The intruders had entered the flat. Eva led Jan through the alley, weaving between bins and puddles until they emerged onto a busier street. They ducked into a tram just as it pulled away. Through the rain-streaked window, Jan caught sight of the man in the coat stepping into the alley they had just left. He looked up at the tram, his expression unreadable. Eva handed Jan the bag. We need somewhere safe. Somewhere they will not think to look. Jan thought for a moment, then said, the old windmill. By the time they reached the windmill, the rain had eased to a mist. The tall structure loomed against the night sky, its blades still. Jan unlocked the heavy wooden door, the hinges groaning as they stepped inside. The interior smelled of dry grain and timber. Jan had not used this place in years, but he knew its secrets. Behind a loose panel in the floor was a narrow space, once used for hiding valuables during the war. He pulled it open and placed the laptop inside. Eva looked around. They will search the farm eventually. I know, Jan replied, but they will not think to look here. They sat in the dim light of a single lantern, the quiet broken only by the occasional creak of the structure in the wind. Jan's thoughts turned to Lars. He wanted to believe his son could be saved from this path, but the evidence was heavy against him. From outside came the crunch of gravel. Jan and Eva froze. Then came the sound of footsteps approaching the door. The footsteps stopped just outside. Jan reached for a wooden beam, ready to defend himself if necessary. The door handle turned slowly, the old wood rattling in its frame. Then a voice, calm, measured, and chillingly familiar. Father, we need to talk. Lars stepped inside, closing the door behind him. His eyes flicked to Eva, then back to January. I know you have something that belongs to me. Jan stood firm. It belongs to the truth. Lars's smile was faint, almost pitying. Truth is a matter of perspective. And right now, I control the perspective. The wind outside picked up, rattling the blades of the windmill. Lars took a step closer, his voice dropping to a whisper. Give me the laptop and I will make this easy. Refuse, and you will lose everything. Eva shifted slightly, her hand near the lantern. Jan could feel the air tighten, the moment balancing on the edge of something irreversible. The lantern flickered, and in that dim light, Jan realized they were no longer alone in the windmill.